The quiet of the ranch. Ethan Cole had grown accustomed to the hush of his ranch. Mornings arrived with a whisper of wind through corn stalks and the distant call of a hawk circling above the hills. He moved through the routines of his day with mechanical precision, feeding the cattle, checking fences, repairing gates, each motion familiar and comforting in its repetition. Yet beneath the rhythm of work, a gnawing emptiness persisted, a quiet ache that not even the vast expanse of his land could fill. Clara, his wife, was present in the house, yet often felt like a stranger passing through. Her days were consumed by endless meetings and phone calls, her face perpetually illuminated by the cold glow of a laptop screen. Ethan had long since stopped seeking her attention. The polite conversations that remained were shallow, perfunctory exchanges that failed to touch anything deeper. He sometimes caught glimpses of her in fleeting moments, her fingers tapping furiously at the keyboard, her eyes distant, lost in a world he could no longer enter, and he felt a pang of sorrow for the life they had quietly surrendered. It was during one such morning that a notice arrived in the mail, fluttering across the rough wooden floorboards. Ethan opened it with absent-minded curiosity, scanning the words about a government program offering temporary lodging assistance for seasonal workers. The idea of having someone on the property, a companion of sorts, stirred an unusual mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He had always believed himself invisible to the world, a man overlooked and quietly forgotten. Yet the thought of someone needing him, truly needing him, provoked a pulse of unfamiliar excitement. A week later, Mei Lin arrived. She stepped from the small transport van with careful precision, her eyes bright but cautious, scanning the ranch as though it were a place both foreign and dangerous. She carried a modest bag and a quiet determination, her posture rigid with restraint. Ethan met her at the gate, offering a simple nod and a hand to guide her in. The air between them was tentative, filled with unspoken questions and polite hesitations. I need a place to stay," Mei Lin said softly, her voice barely louder than the rustle of the wind through the tall grasses. "It's temporary and I must pretend to be married." Her words struck Ethan with the weight of a puzzle. Pretend to be married? He glanced at her, searching for a hint of jest, but found only sincerity and fear. "I already have a wife," he said, his voice measured, even as an unexpected tension tightened in his chest. The words felt heavier than he intended. There was a pause, the silence stretching over the ranch like the shadows cast by the early sun. Mei Lin's gaze dropped, her hands clutching the straps of her bag, as if it were a lifeline. "Then I will disappear," she whispered, almost to herself, though Ethan heard it with clarity. The faint tremor in her voice betrayed her vulnerability, and Ethan felt an unfamiliar stirring of protectiveness. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, that she would not need to face the world alone, but the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he nodded curtly, masking the disquiet that had begun to settle in his chest. They moved through the day in careful, deliberate steps. Ethan showed her the barn, the small kitchen, the modest room where she would stay. Every gesture, every exchange, carried an undercurrent of curiosity and unspoken tension. Ethan observed her small acts, the way she methodically unpacked her belongings, the way her fingers lingered over the handle of the sink, the way her eyes flickered to the horizon, as if weighing the possibilities of escape. And though he would never admit it aloud, he felt something he had not felt in years, the sense of being needed, of being seen. As evening descended, the ranch took on a quiet serenity. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields. Mei Lin prepared a modest dinner, the aroma of simple ingredients filling the small kitchen. Ethan watched from the doorway, noticing the care in her movements, the grace in her unspoken manners. He realized, almost with fear, that he was paying attention in a way he hadn't allowed himself for decades. When the dishes were done, Mei Lin turned to him with a hesitant smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "For everything, even for listening." Ethan nodded again, a lump forming in his throat, the weight of years pressing down on him. He wanted to respond, to say more, but no words came. Instead, they shared the silence, a silence that felt alive, brimming with possibility and danger alike. And in that quiet moment, Ethan understood the conflict that would shape the days to come. He had believed himself invisible, overlooked, unwanted. Yet now, with Mei Lin on his land, he sensed the stirring of a connection that could not easily be ignored. A connection that, once acknowledged, might alter everything he thought he knew about himself, his marriage, and the boundaries he had so carefully maintained. The night deepened, and the ranch settled into the hush of crickets and rustling leaves. Ethan stood by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky, aware that nothing would remain the same. Not after today, not after her presence had quietly, irrevocably entered his life. Pretend, yet real. The morning sun spilled across the ranch, painting the fields in golden hues, but the warmth did little to ease the tension that lingered in the kitchen. Ethan moved with deliberate caution, aware of Mei Lin's presence more acutely than he had anticipated. The air was thick with unspoken questions, her need for a facade, his own curiosity, and a fragile moral line neither of them dared cross. Do I need to act like your wife in front of anyone?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence while washing the coffee cups. His tone was neutral, but beneath it lay a flicker of unease. Mei Lin paused, her delicate fingers hovering over a stack of napkins. "Only when officials come, or anyone who might ask. It's temporary," she murmured, her voice low, almost swallowed by the hum of the refrigerator. "I must appear protected, safe." Ethan nodded, setting the last cup aside. The idea of pretending, of orchestrating a small, private deception, was oddly intoxicating. Not that he admitted it, even to himself. Yet each glance he stole at her reflected a subtle fascination, a recognition of the life force she carried despite the constraints around her. The days settled into a careful rhythm. They shared chores, stacking hay bales, mending fences, tending to the livestock. Mei Lin moved with quiet efficiency, yet she carried an air of hesitancy, glancing at Ethan as if seeking reassurance in every small act. There was a poetry in her restraint, a kind of grace he had long since ceased to notice in anyone. During one afternoon of hauling firewood, she stumbled slightly, the weight of the bundle tipping precariously. Without thinking, Ethan's hand shot out, steadying her. Their fingers brushed, brief but electric, and for a moment, neither spoke. Mei Lin's eyes met his, wide and unguarded, and Ethan felt a pulse of warmth he hadn't recognized in years. He pulled back, reminding himself it was nothing, just routine, just precaution. Yet the silence that followed was telling. Words were unnecessary. The air between them had shifted. Ethan realized that in this performance of a marriage, they had already begun to cross into uncharted emotional territory. The danger lay not in the act itself, but in the intimacy that followed, the quiet moments where laughter lingered, where glances held meaning, and where confessions waited to be spoken. Evenings were the hardest. Clara's absence grew more pronounced with each passing day, her work excuses arriving like clockwork. Ethan found himself sharing meals with Mei Lin, noticing her subtle gestures, the soft cadence of her speech, the way her hair fell across her shoulder as she washed dishes. He listened, not with the distracted mind that once wandered during conversations with his wife, but fully, attentively, as though the world had narrowed to the space they occupied together. One evening, as the wind rattled the window panes and the first drops of rain began to fall, Mei Lin spoke of her life before the ranch. She told Ethan of the debts she carried, the people who demanded compliance, the years of servitude that had eroded her sense of autonomy. Her voice was steady, but the tremor at the edge betrayed her history of fear and submission. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He only nodded, letting the weight of her words sink in. He understood now that her need to pretend was more than legal necessity. It was survival, a mask forged by necessity and circumstance. And yet, beneath the mask, he sensed a spirit that had been worn thin but not broken. That night, As they stacked firewood in the dim light of the barn, a quiet connection took shape. Their hands met again while passing a heavy log, lingering longer than was necessary. Mei Lin's eyes searched his, a question unspoken, a tentative probe into the boundaries they had yet to define. Ethan's chest tightened, a mixture of guilt and desire warring within him. The line between act and reality blurred with each passing day, each small shared gesture. By the end of the week, the first official inspection loomed. They rehearsed a casual domesticity, sharing conversations over breakfast, laughing quietly when miscommunication caused minor mishaps. Their pretense was convincing, if only to outsiders. But beneath the surface, each exchange carried the weight of emotions neither wanted to acknowledge. As night settled over the ranch, Ethan lingered in the doorway of the small guest room, watching Mei Lin prepare for bed. He recognized a shift, a subtle change in how they navigated the space between them. The pretense was no longer just a performance. It had begun to shape their reality. And in that quiet moment, he understood the danger that lay ahead. The line between acting and feeling, between loyalty and desire, was becoming increasingly indistinct. The ranch was silent except for the rhythmic patter of rain and the soft creak of wooden beams. Ethan closed the door gently, leaving Mei Lin with the space she needed, yet carrying the knowledge that tomorrow and the day after would bring new moments, moments that would test the boundaries of both morality and heart. And somewhere deep within him, a small, unacknowledged spark had been lit, one that promised both warmth and peril. Crossing a line, rain had returned in a steady rhythm, drumming against the corrugated roof of the barn and filling the silence between tasks with its relentless insistence. Ethan worked alongside Mei Lin, stacking hay with deliberate movements, yet his focus was fractured. Every glance she stole at him, every tentative brush of her hand, lingered in his mind far longer than it should have. The moral boundaries he had relied upon were eroding, replaced by a raw awareness of how much he needed her presence, and how dangerous that need had become. Mei Lin moved with efficiency, yet there was a tension in her shoulders, a subtle anxiety that did not escape Ethan. He had come to understand that her polite, controlled exterior concealed a deep vulnerability. She was alone in a strange country, navigating rules she barely understood and relying on him for protection, though he suspected she resented that dependency as much as she accepted it. The storm outside deepened, winds rattling the barn's wooden slats, and Ethan found himself unusually aware of the small space they shared. When a pile of hay threatened to topple, his hand shot out to steady it, and hers, brushing his in a way that made his chest tighten. They paused, hands lingering, and for a heartbeat, the world shrank to the narrow confines of the barn. Words were unnecessary. The intensity of the moment spoke volumes. "I shouldn't be leaning on you so much," Mei Lin murmured, her voice trembling ever so slightly, betraying the calm she tried to maintain. Ethan shook his head, aware of his own breath catching. "You're not a burden," he said quietly, the truth of it lingering between them. In that instant, the line between protector and something far more personal became indistinct, and both recognized it. The pretense of a harmless arrangement had begun to unravel. That night, the ranch was cloaked in darkness, the storm still raging outside. Ethan moved quietly to check on the livestock, only to find Mei Lin waiting in the dim light of the barn's doorway. Her expression was taut with unspoken words, her eyes searching his. "I don't want to just act anymore," she admitted, voice barely above the whisper of rain. I want to be safe, yes, but also seen, truly seen." Ethan's chest tightened. He had long yearned to feel needed, to matter to someone beyond the routine of a life shared with a wife who no longer noticed him. And now, here was Mei Lin, laying bare a truth that echoed his own hidden desires. He took a step closer, cautious yet compelled, and their eyes locked. The first kiss was hesitant, a mere brush of lips, yet it carried the weight of all the days spent pretending, of all the unspoken longing between them. Both recoiled for a moment, startled by the intensity, and then, unable to resist, returned to it with growing urgency. The moral conflict was immediate. Ethan's loyalty to Clara warred with the undeniable connection he felt in this singular, stolen moment. Morning arrived with a reluctant clarity. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick and fragrant with wet earth. Ethan awoke in his own bed, haunted by the memory of the night, the taste of temptation lingering like a shadow over his conscience. Mei Lin moved through the kitchen, quiet but purposeful, the normality of routine now tinged with the knowledge that nothing between them could remain entirely innocent. Clara's absence became more conspicuous, her rare texts and phone calls interruptions rather than engagement. Ethan realized that what had begun as emotional support had already crept into territory far more intimate, and the guilt pressed heavily against the exhilaration. He understood, with stark clarity, that the moment of crossing, once past, changed everything. They avoided the explicit acknowledgement of their actions, yet every glance, every careful touch, now carried the resonance of what had occurred. Words were scarce, but the space between them was charged, filled with tension and unspoken understanding. Ethan knew he was complicit in more than a charade. He was entwined in a reality that threatened to dismantle his life. The week continued with careful, tense normality. They completed chores, maintained appearances, and exchanged only what was necessary with outsiders. Yet the nights were different. Each shared silence, each inadvertent brush of fingers, reminded them of the choice they had made and the consequences that loomed. Mei Lin's eyes, once polite and cautious, now held a softness and vulnerability reserved for someone trusted implicitly, a trust Ethan could neither fully embrace nor entirely deny. By the time the next official visit was scheduled, Ethan understood that the pretense had shifted. What had begun as a simple act for survival was now an emotional affair, delicate and dangerous. The tension between duty and desire had grown palpable, and neither could ignore the implications. As the sun set over the ranch, Ethan stood at the edge of the fields, watching the light fade into a bruised purple sky. He knew that tomorrow, the delicate balance they maintained could shatter. The line had been crossed, the boundaries blurred, and the storm that raged outside mirrored the one now threatening to consume his conscience. And yet, amid the moral uncertainty, one undeniable truth lingered. For the first time in years, Ethan felt alive. Consequences and choices. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth from the storm that had passed. Ethan moved through the ranch with mechanical efficiency, the weight of last week's events pressing heavily on his shoulders. The barn, once a place of routine labor and quiet reflection, now felt charged with memories, of whispered confessions, hesitant touches, and a single night that had crossed all boundaries. Each step reminded him that there was no undoing what had been done. Clara arrived unexpectedly, her presence announced only by the sound of her boots crunching on gravel. She carried herself with the same calm, controlled demeanor she always had, but Ethan immediately sensed the tension beneath it. There was no warmth in her eyes, only scrutiny. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but edged with an unfamiliar sharpness. Ethan nodded, motioning for her to follow him to the living room. The walls seemed smaller, more confining than usual, as if the space itself recognized the gravity of the conversation. Clara's questions were direct, probing the inconsistencies she had noticed. The unusual schedule, the changes in the house, the lingering atmosphere that seemed both charged and secretive. Ethan responded with practiced restraint, careful not to reveal the full depth of his indiscretion. Yet he could not hide the guilt that flickered in his expression, subtle but undeniable. "You've been distant for months," Clara continued, her voice softening slightly. "I thought it was just the stress of ranch work. But now, I see that distance was more than exhaustion. Was there someone else?" Her words landed like stones, heavy and precise. Ethan swallowed, feeling the lump of remorse in his throat. "It wasn't planned," he said quietly. "It started as something small, something I thought I could control. But it grew, and I couldn't stop it." He looked at Clara, hoping to convey the complexity of his emotions, the mix of guilt, longing, and genuine care for Mei Lin. Clara remained silent for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "I've checked out of this marriage a long time ago," she admitted, her voice tinged with regret rather than anger. "I wasn't cruel. I was distant because I didn't know how to stay connected. But I never imagined it would come to this." The admission stung, but it also brought clarity. Ethan realized that the breach, though morally significant, had occurred within a marriage already hollowed by neglect. His heart ached with the weight of all the years they had quietly drifted apart. Later that day, Ethan found Mei Lin in the barn, preparing to leave. She carried a small bag, her expression guarded, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of hope. "I can't be the reason you destroy yourself," she said softly, voice steady but quivering beneath the surface. "I can't live in someone else's mistakes. I need to leave." Ethan approached cautiously, the distance between them heavy with unspoken emotions. "I understand," he said, "but you should know. I've already lost a marriage long before you arrived. What I feel for you isn't just pretense. It's real." Her gaze met his, searching, questioning, hesitant. For a moment, the world outside the barn seemed to disappear. The storm of consequence and guilt held at bay by the fragile connection they had nurtured. "I don't know if I can trust myself or you," Mei Lin said quietly. "But maybe we can try." Carefully, honestly, Ethan nodded, a mixture of relief and apprehension stirring in his chest. They had crossed lines, felt temptation, and acknowledged desire, yet now stood at the precipice of something fragile and genuine. The path forward would require honesty, patience, and mutual respect, qualities they had never allowed themselves before. That evening, Ethan walked alone to the edge of the fields, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The ranch was quiet, bathed in a golden haze. He thought of Clara, of the life they had shared, and of Mei Lin, whose presence had awakened emotions long dormant. He understood that love born from imperfection carried its own weight, demanding responsibility and conscious choice. When he returned, Mei Lin was sitting quietly on the porch, hands folded in her lap, watching the horizon. He joined her, and for the first time in months, the silence between them was comfortable, not tense. Words were unnecessary. Their mutual understanding bridged the past and hinted at the future. The night deepened, stars emerging one by one, and Ethan realized that consequences had been faced, mistakes acknowledged, and boundaries redrawn. The affair had begun as pretense, became desire, and now, in the aftermath, offered the possibility of redemption, if handled with care and honesty. As they sat together, the ranch alive only with the whisper of wind and the distant calls of wildlife, Ethan felt a fragile hope take root. Life would not be simple. Trust would need to be rebuilt. Choices would have to be honored. Yet amid the complexity, one truth remained undeniable. For the first time in years, he felt seen, needed, and alive. And that realization, fragile as it was, promised a path forward, one born of consequence, courage, and the possibility of love renewed, even in the wake of betrayal.